Excellent, thank you. And I'm going to pass over to my colleague from the BCC, Jess Farrell, who's going to talk a little bit about the history of how we got to the programme today.
Awesome. Thanks, Sharon. We have been working on the Python study groups as a pilot in the Bit Creator Consortium since 2020. So it's taken a few years to grow it to the point of where it is now. And I just wanted to share a little bit about that and acknowledge the people that really helped bring this program together over the years. So my name is Jess. I'm here to share some context about the Python study groups. It started as a little idea at the 2020 Bit Creator Forum, and today we've been able to grow it and take it to the next stage of coordination with leadership and support from the Digital Preservation Coalition. The idea to launch a Python study group originated in the midst of a lively discussion during a session on digital archivist educational needs at that 2020 Bit Creator Forum. So during that conversation in Zoom, it was our first virtual forum. We had lots of people in Zoom having lively conversation. Many attendees responded to the idea of having a study group to gain the motivation and commitment to learn Python. So participants noted that when they attended workshops on Python or other similar technical skills, highly technical workshops and skills that they were trying to develop, they found it difficult to incorporate what they learned back at home in their own projects. Not always because the skills weren't applicable. Sometimes it's hard, definitely, to find, digital preservation focused training. But we're all smart and we can relate what we know, what we learn to digital preservation. So that's not even the biggest problem. It was more that they lacked the structure and incentives to practice what they had learned enough to really be able to use them in production in their own work. So you know how it is, right? You go to a conference, you learn a lot of cool new things, and then you get back home and maybe the work that's actually on your plate doesn't quite accommodate all of the DigiPres innovation dreams you were hoping to realize as you were daydreaming during that conference. So what if you had a group and some meetings set up to help you set aside the time to work on those things? And that's kind of how the idea started. At the same time, I was also thinking about the OSS ArcFlow project. Educopia Institute hosted this research project. It was funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Many of the people in this room probably participated on the project. Thank you for participating, and thanks for being here today too. It aimed to investigate, synchronize, and model workflows using or focusing on open source software platforms, BitCurator Environment, Archivomatica, and ArchiveSpace. And so the research team learned a whole lot in this project about the barriers to making different open source tools interoperable and just chaining together workflows in more automated ways. It's a very highly localized activity. And in institutions where archives lack specialized technical staff to support archival tools and workflows, archivists learning the skills and languages like Python is kind of a prerequisite to being able to chain your workflow together and build automations and improve interoperability among your tools in your workflow. So I felt that perhaps providing spaces to learn Python could be one small seed that grows better interoperability and automation in local workflows over time. Okay, so with all of those grand ideas, we got to work. We had a small working group that formed to begin the task of organizing a Python study group. The demand was community driven from the conference, and so was the labor to start it up. So I definitely want to recognize Shira Peltzman, David Sorella, Sarah Thompson, Dorothy Wall, Elvia Aurora Ramirez, and myself for being the startup team that got together to bring this idea to life. From the beginning, it was an international partnership, as you can see with Dory and Sarah right there in the beginning startup team. And we wanted to make learning a highly technical skill more approachable than it had been for us in the past. So the first thing that we did was talk about what makes learning accessible to us, technical learning, and then drafted our motivation and goals around those ideas, focusing directly on Python. So we wanted people to be unafraid to join the groups and just test them out. And we wanted to make the groups accessible to all skill levels. We identified some barriers to this type of education, which included a lack of formal curriculum and training opportunities that focus on archives and preservation specific applications, a lack of confidence or common feelings of imposter syndrome, and bridging the gap between the skills learned in one-off workshops and those needed to implement practical solutions in everyday work and life. So our hope was that the group would help us overcome some of those obstacles by creating a community of learning that tried to achieve many things. So one of them was focused specifically on cultivating Python skills in order to support library and archives tasks and workflows, empower practitioners to use Python in their everyday work, support accountability for practitioners as they learn and implement Python together, help participants identify resources that are applicable to their real life needs, provide a non-judgmental space where anyone and everyone feels welcomed and valued, regardless of their level of expertise, and then allow for learning and collaboration across time zones, geographies, and distinct institutional contexts. So that's what we did first. We published those motivation and goals that I just described before we really did any recruitment for the groups. We started with what you can expect from the vibe of this group, basically. And then we sent out an interest form to get some more information about what interested participants wanted out of a peer learning space, what time zone they were in, what type of institutional context they were in, so that we could start to form the groups. We got 10 times the volume of responses that we expected. So we had planned to start small, but that became difficult very quickly. And we did stay committed to a very light structure, but we extended our startup planning to accommodate not just one, but many Python study groups. I think we kind of thought we would launch a group after a month or so of planning, and it would be 10 people that would meet every once in a while. It would be really low key, but we really took a step back and decided to plan something a little bit bigger once we saw that there was such a need in the community. We never did set out to develop a curriculum and formalize learning tracks. Developing a curriculum or online course was really far beyond our capacity and resources as a volunteer group. Instead, we developed a model structure and roles for people to have to increase the chances of the groups being self-sustaining and productive. And we drafted some documents required to support that model. So we created a sign-up sheet that incorporated the group's time zones, skill level, and frequency of meetings so that people could figure out where they fit and what they would like to sign up for based on those attributes. We developed a template community agreement that we asked groups to review and revise as needed for their particular group to address that piece about making sure that we have a safe space for everybody to learn and experiment with technology. We created instructions for everyone to start with. So they were light. The first instruction was install Python. That's the first thing you can do together if you haven't taken that step. And then the second was to go through a file renaming activity. And for the purposes of the pilot, that was the extent of our curriculum. And then we created a centralized drive space to find documentation on group coordination and then collect notes on the curriculum. And we set up a Slack channel for people to communicate with. And while, yes, those things were all a lot of work to set up, that's where we cut it off. We hope that it would be enough structure for people to engage with, but light enough to keep many possibilities open and for us to kind of evaluate what was going on. The guidance we gave around agenda setting was to give people space to just check in at the beginning and try to make sure there's some time in each meeting to chat about future lessons. Then we launched the sign up, 8 groups formed. After the launch, the groups met on their own. At this point, activities became really decentralized. We just kind of observed, I observed and followed along. The coordinators that had helped out went to their own Python study groups and learned Python with their groups. Some coordinators lost steam, some continued for a year or more. So there was a lot of variation there. Diane Dietrich, who served as a mentor to groups throughout the pilot, would check in on Slack sometimes and get people to chat about what they were working on, share resources, or post 5-minute Python activities, which was really helpful. And after about 6 months of groups meeting on their own, a new coordination team composed of the coordinator of each study group got together to evaluate the pilot and determine next steps. So we surveyed participants again to find out what they wanted to see the pilot grow into. We heard that most groups lost energy at the point of picking their next lesson, and they would just like some more options for what to do next. Not necessarily a formal, curriculum that they have to choose, but just at least a list of options of things to do next. We also heard that the coordinators did a ton of work to shepherd their group and help evaluate the pilot. So with a very decentralized model, these coordinators were scheduling their own meetings. They were doing things to kind of get everybody together for the meeting. And I know this was really tough to do in addition to wanting to learn Python yourself as a participant in the group. So this was another thing that folks pointed out as kind of a heavy burden on the model that we had created. And it wasn't surprising. We had sought to develop a model for maybe a small single group, but we did our best to accommodate the large number of people who are interested in getting involved. So thank you so much to everybody who's listed on the screen right now. These were the coordinators who nurtured the project through 2020 to 2022 before we met up with Sharon, because during the pilot evaluation, Sharon joined the team, and that was very exciting. And since we already had many Digital Preservation Coalition members involved, it was really easy to agree to work together to transform this little project from a pilot at the BCC to a co-hosted program that could be better supported with our powers combined. So at the end of 2022, Sharon and I formed a transition team to address the feedback that we received throughout the pilot and to relaunch as a co-hosted sustained program. And that is where we are today. So thank you everyone who has engaged on the transition team over the past year as well. It's been a brilliant, fun group of folks who have developed the new program for all of you that are in attendance today. And I'll pass it along to Sharon to say where we're going to go from here.
Thanks, Jess. So yeah, we've been doing the transition phase for the last year, and we've got a little short presentation now from my colleague at the DPC, Amy Curry, who's going to talk about why we were keen to get involved from the DPC and what we've been up to during that transition phase. So over to Amy.
So hi everyone, I'm Amy Curry and I'm training grants manager at the DPC. And yes, as Sharon mentioned, I'll just pick up a little bit about the transition team and the work that Jess and Sharon did to bring the BCC and DPC worlds together. So a little bit from where we were coming from the DPC front, there was a lot of alignment between our members as well as the BCC members. And we had some clear hopes for what we wanted to achieve with getting on board with the pilot study group program. So this was going to meet a very clear professional development need that had been identified by our DPC members. There were lots of members who had spoken to us about how they would really love to use Python at their organization, but just didn't know where to get started, especially with how Python could be applied to digital preservation work, more specifically, echoing exactly the same issues and areas that Jess mentioned as part of the BCC and the pilot. So we were also aware, as a slightly bigger team, DPC had the capacity for helping with the sustainability of the program over time. We had a more administrative support that we could provide. And we also wanted to create a resource for the whole community could benefit from. So having that infrastructure in place, administrative support, and more on this later, but really being able to retain the collaborative group owned ethos. And so Jess and Sharon brought together everyone to start the transition team, which I'm part as the admin bit of that. And we have many members here today, as well as those that Jess had shared in her slide. So a little bit more about the plan. So the high level plan for the transition was to review the already available resources to support the learning process, to develop a sustainable administrative structure to help manage as an ongoing program, and to implement a schedule for more global participation, but in line with a sustainable administrative structure. So we wanted to also continue to offer access to the groups for free for that continued collaborative working. And because it was a DPC and BCC collaborative effort, we are going to have priority places for those members, but we also have places for non-members as well. So it roughly is about a third split between BCC, DPC, and non-members for the study groups. So the transition team, that was evolved from a recruitment of volunteers from across the BCC and DPC communities. And just to give you a little bit about what the transition team has been up to, we had a range of people on the team with different experiences, myself with limited Python, but more admin. We had others with more experience with Python itself. We had a really good mix of people who participated and were very generous with their time to help with the planning for the transition team. And we've worked throughout 2023 to help deliver the program, being organized in 3 main groups: the administrative group, the communications group, and the content group. So I just mentioned I'm part of the admin team, which is the boring but critical and necessary things that we needed to cover. I might argue not that boring, but basically the administration team worked on the terms of reference for the groups, for adding materials to the website, and figuring out how to do the registrations and then manage them as we go, helping with establishing the governance group, what that means, thinking about evaluation as an ongoing process for improvement, which is facilitated through the governance group. Again, thinking about this long-term sustainability, writing and helping write role descriptions, including the roles of mentors and governance, which we will share a little bit more about in just a little bit. And also scheduling with different time zone considerations to hopefully maximize the participation globally. We also had a communications team, which was looking at planning, getting the news out there, planning and scheduling for the relaunch, drafting the news items, making sure they're tailored to different audiences, which I think they've done a tremendous job because we've had a great number of registrations for these 2 events and from a range of people. And also coming up with like a sustainable communications plan for the groups once they're active. And as we move into the different phases of recruitment. And then the biggest team, of course, is the content team, which we're looking at reviewing the existing learning materials from the pilot and where would want to find or develop additional materials. Just to say, while at one point, the content team did think about building a curriculum in scope of what they were going to do, but quickly realized that with all elements of digital preservation work, that kind of it depends answer really comes into play. So when they're thinking about the study groups, everyone will be looking to deploy Python a bit differently, as well as there might be slightly different levels of learning or knowledge. And so in that way, wanted to have groups to be flexible to accommodate that better. So instead, the hope is to work on a variety of resources to help support learning without making it too rigid into one sort of curriculum structure, to have those materials available through a GitHub so they can be helped more. They can be shared more broadly beyond the study groups, but I won't chat too much about this because we actually have Julian and members of our content team here to tell a little bit more about the content development and the progress of resources. So I will stop my shared screen and we can set that up for our content team colleague.
Great, thank you. Okay. A little bit about myself. My name is Julian Pascoe. I'm a digital archivist at Library and Archives Canada, and I will be highlighting some of the work we've done on the content team and their supporting resources that we've developed. Next slide. So as Amy mentioned, in developing the content for this program, we started with a review of the existing resources generated from the previous iteration of this project hosted by BitCurator, and discussed what would be useful to include and what additional resources could be developed. This led to a list of content that we could further refine in subgroups, including a Python primer, an example Python how-tos or walkthrough exercises that people could use to get started with Python, and a list of use cases for using Python in digital preservation. In addition, we decided to make use of GitHub as a platform for collaborative, peer-supported learning and editing. GitHub is already well established in terms of supporting the programming community and aligns with the goals of the Python Study Group program in creating a framework for continued learning and collaboration. Some of the features of GitHub that are useful for this work are its approach to versioning, editing capacity, and support from multiple contributors in working together on coding projects. The goal of this content As Amy mentioned too, the goal of this content and the resources we've developed is not to create a curriculum, but more of a framework or starting point for study groups to use for getting their feet wet with Python, and from there building their own exploration. Basically, a choose your own adventure with Python, depending on the various levels and learning goals in each group, with some initial guidance and documents, as well as the collaborative peer-based support of the program. Next slide. Thank you. So with the Python primer, early on, we discussed the need for having a centralized resource about all things Python that a beginner would find useful and could serve as a reference point during the initial stages of learning Python. Basically, a one-stop resource for information about Python. The primer provides a generalized overview of Python. It introduces the language as well as key concepts. It also discusses how Python relates specifically to digital preservation work and competencies. And you can see this section here on the slide. This information can be used to build awareness of Python's potential in the digital preservation practitioner's toolkit, as well as potentially informing advocacy for developing this skill. And you can see on the right side of the screen is some of the other sections that we've included in the Python primer, such as getting started with Python, installation guidance, coding examples, good practice notes, and of course, additional resources to review. We see this document as evolving over time as a learning resource. It serves as the starting point for us to consolidate and build out useful information, and it is our hope that the study groups can take it on and expand and contribute as needed. Next slide, please. So for the Python how-to guides, these are some walkthroughs to get started with on your group's coding journey, but are by no means prescriptive. The idea being this is very much peer-directed learning, and again, a sort of choose your own adventure to learning Python. The goal with these was to have some different exercises to get started with using Python, as well as some ideas for how to use the language in digital preservation tasks. So some examples that you can see here are removing unwanted files, for example, system-based files such as those pesky thumbs DB that we are all familiar with, batch renaming file names in subfolders, so how to recursively run through a list of files in a folder, and find and replace a string in file names. So these are fairly common ways of using Python and working with digital files, as well as for potentially using in routine digital preservation tasks, and that they can be used to start to build familiarity with the language and to work together within your groups. The guides are relatively straightforward exercises that demonstrate some of the key features of Python, as well as its potential application in digital preservation. Next slide, please. And last but not least, we have been also working on a list of use cases for using Python in digital preservation activities. This resource provides some additional ideas for how Python could be used in routine digital preservation tasks, as well as some potential exercises to work through. This list can be referred to by the study groups in deciding their direction for learning Python. It's currently categorized by level of expertise, and some future work might include adding additional categories for the types of digital preservation activities that these examples cover, for instance, file management, metadata transformations, file validation, identification, zip packaging, etc. That's it for the resources on the content team. So passing it back to the team.
Excellent, thanks, Julianne. So I'm going to take over now, and in our final short presentation for this today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Python study group program will actually function, and how you can sign up to be part of the program. So in terms of the logistics side of things about how the groups will work, the plan is that the groups will work on a kind of 6-monthly cycle, which will be January to June and July to December. And within each of those 6-monthly cycles, the groups will meet in the 4th week of the month. In the first instance, groups will be for that 6 months, but will have an option to renew for another 6 months if they find they still have the momentum and want to continue to meet. The groups are going to be held as part of two cohorts. So this is part of that taking away the kind of administrative burden that some of the coordinators felt of having to be the one organising the Zoom calls and making sure the rooms are available and such like that. So we're going to be bringing all the groups together at the same time so that that lessens that pressure a bit. So we've got picked two cohort meeting times that are roughly the same times as these information sessions. And as part of each cohort, so there can be up to 10 study groups of 8 people each. And we've tried to pick these times to kind of cover as many time zones as possible to make them as accessible to as many people as possible. And each of these sessions is going to be hosted by a DPC member of staff who'll act as the kind of pilot on Zoom, so the person that's there to actually make sure the meeting invites go out to everybody, that they're there to open up the room, and then assign each group out to the breakout room where they'll be able to have their study group meeting. Each of the meetings will last for up to 2 hours, but of course there's no requirement that every group needs to stay for those 2 hours. So it'll be a case of if your group only wants to spend an hour chatting in a particular month, then that's fine for you to leave the meeting space. And the Zoom pilot from the DPC will either stay there for the 2 hours or until all of the groups have finished for that month. That's kind of a little bit about how the logistics will work. In terms of the learning, as you've heard a few times already, the groups are going to focus primarily on a kind of peer-to-peer support approach to learning. So again, not that formal curriculum, but rather bringing together people who are at the same kind of level of knowledge in terms of their Python learning journey, or with particular similar interests in how to deploy Python for their digital preservation work. And that's us to allow us to have that kind of flexibility about being again relevant to people across their Python learning journey. So inclusive of people at different learning knowledge levels. So starting from people who've not looked at Python before in the past, have never installed it, have no idea anything about the coding, through to people who are perhaps a little bit further on, who started using Python for their digital preservation tasks, but want to have a little bit more support in getting into kind of a bit more deeply into Python coding. I have to say, I did like a quote that I saw come up in the chat from someone about what their purpose and wanting to get involved in this is to go from having their work to workflow. I think that's a really great kind of analogy of what we're hoping to get here, to get people moving on and to allow that kind of additional kind of automation and help that Python can give to you. Groups will be there as well to set their own goals and priorities. So again, we're not going to be telling you what you need to do. Hopefully that's something that you'll be able to agree within your study group about what your goals are. And you might look to set kind of small incremental goals. So it might not be that you might have a goal for the whole 6-month period of your study group, or you might say, set yourselves tasks for every month and come back and report on them and feedback and discuss what you've been doing. The plan is to have at least one mentor available at each of the study group sessions who's there to answer questions or offer advice. So basically somebody from your group would be able to drop a message to say, we've got something we'd like to talk to the mentor about, can they come and join us, to help so that you've got somebody with that little bit more experience there, knowledge of Python, in case you get a little bit stuck in what you're doing. And as Julianne said, we're hoping that we will build out the GitHub resources over time. So we've got a kind of really great foundation there now that the content team has been working on, but we hope that the GitHub will be a place where people can post questions, ask for help or feedback about what they're doing in their study groups, and also potentially post code examples or useful resources that we found. And all of this will work together to be a kind of a growing resource that will help people with their Python learning. An important thing to point out there is, while we are managing this particular program for the study groups with a set number of people who'll be able to participate in that each cycle, the GitHub repository is public, and we're hoping that if other people out there want to run their own Python study group, that they'll find the resources that we've put together on the GitHub to be useful for that, and they're going to be available on an open license for others to reuse. Just to get down on the things that the groups will not offer, though, just for sake of clarity, as we've already said a couple of times, that this isn't going to be a detailed curriculum for learning Python within digital preservation. It is that choose your own adventure, as Julian described. So it's going to be that, but it has the benefit again of it being that kind of flexibility. This isn't going to be something that's going to provide any kind of certification on the use of Python at the end of it because of that flexible peer-to-peer approach. And while mentors are going to be there to support people in their learning, this isn't going to be any kind of formal consultation on how to deploy Python within your organization. So they can offer some advice and feedback, but it's not going to be take it any further than that. We have certain expectations of people who are in the different roles who are going to be involved in this, and I'll just run kind of briefly through them as well. So for all of our people, everyone that's going to be involved in the Python study groups, we will be asking them to adhere to the values set out in the terms of reference document that the admin team has developed. And that particularly, like the pilot, includes strong commitments to inclusion and mutual support within the study groups. We ask that if you sign up for the programme that you have a reasonable confidence that you will be able to actually attend the sessions at the advertised times, and they are on the sign up sheet for this, so you'll be able to see what they are ahead of time. We ask that you have, again, a reasonable confidence that you'll have the capacity to spend at least a little bit of time learning Python between sessions. So it'd be work on the problems and coding issues that you've discussed within your study group. We ask everybody who's planning to take part to actively participate in the group as well. Because peer-to-peer learning is at the core of this, it's not going to work if there's only a couple of people in the group who actually chat, and everybody else sits there with their microphones and cameras off. So please, we really want you to make sure that there's active participation in the groups. We also want to make sure that you share responsibility for chairing their group. So I think it's always best if there's one person who takes on a bit of responsibility at each meeting to be the person who's kind of moving things along. So perhaps we work out a rota in your group for who is going to be chairing it. As mentioned already, we hope that you will, as your learning goes on, if you create anything or have any useful questions to ask, contribute them to the Python study group GitHub resources. And finally, if you participate in the groups, we'll ask you to provide feedback to our governance group, who is going to be working on a kind of rolling evaluation and continued planning and strategizing for how the groups will develop over time. We don't expect this to be a static program. We want to continue to grow it, expand it, and improve it over time. In terms of expectations of mentors, again, that adherence to the values set out in the terms of reference. We're looking for people who are relatively proficient in coding with Python, but you don't necessarily need to be an amazing expert in it, but just somebody who has done some good work in terms of using Python for digital preservation tasks. Ideally also that you'd be relatively familiar with using GitHub, although we are going to be providing some support on how to use GitHub for participants, so that can obviously be available to mentors as well. And that you would be willing to provide support for issues logged there by participants. We ask that you'd be able to attend Python study group meetings as needed. As mentioned, we want it to have at least one mentor at every group meeting to be there to answer questions. We're hoping that if we can get enough mentors, that's going to be, I've got here no more than one per month, but it's probably, I think we seem to be getting quite a good a response already after our first information session this morning. So we're hoping that maybe will actually be attending maybe one meeting every 2 or 3 months on a rota basis that would be agreed to suit your availability. And again, we would like you to be providing feedback to the governance group about how you think that the study groups are working and what could be improved, what's working well, things like that. And finally, we are looking to recruit a small number of people to join the governance group who will oversee the programme, who will do things like the planning and strategy, but also potentially, if we do have any issues that need to be dealt with, be available to help out with that. I think we're looking for, if I remember rightly, 3 people to join us for a group of 5 total. Again, adherence to the values set out in the terms of reference. For the governance group, we are looking for people who are Bit Creator Consortium or DPC members and are contributing in some way to the Python study groups. So we hope out of those 3, at least 1 person will be a participant in the groups and at least 1 person will be in a mentor role. You need to be committing to attend regular meetings, but that's only going to be 2 a year for the regular sessions. There may be the need to have ad hoc meetings as required. We'll be holding the meetings slightly out of sync with the kind of start and end of the group cycle itself, so probably around 2 months after, when the kind of switchover time is when we'll be scheduling those meetings in to allow that process of evaluation. So you'd be contributing to that, the strategy and planning of the groups. So we're now at the crunch part. How do you actually sign up to participate? Ellie will be sharing in chat now a link to an expression of interest form that we'll ask you to fill out if you are interested in participating in the study groups. And you can indicate on that form whether you're wanting to take part as a participant in the group, if you're available to help out as a mentor, and or if you would like to put yourself forward to take part in the governance group that will be overseeing everything. The plan is that the admin team will be reviewing and processing those expression of interest forms. And as mentioned, there will be priority places for Bit Creator Consortium and DPC members. So we have up to 80 places available in each of the 2 cohorts, and we're splitting that up. There'll be 25 priority places in each cohort for BCC members, 25 for DPC members, and then for 30 people who are not a member of either of those organisations. And you will receive then later notification of whether you've just managed to get a staggered place on the study groups for this cycle, or if you're going on a waiting list. And this will be an ongoing programme. So if you don't necessarily make it into this time round, then we will give anybody on the waiting list first refusal for places on the next cycle of the study group programme. And we think this is probably the time zone there's going to be most demanding. So I will be honest and say that I don't think we will manage to fit everybody in this time, but we will be continuing this on and making more places available in the future. Once you've know whether you've got a place or not, we'll then be getting people to sign up for particular groups and sorting people by their level of knowledge and their interest in what they want to do in terms of Python. In terms of the timeline for the kickoff, that expression of interest form is open now, and it's going to be open until the 3rd of November. We are giving a bit of priority to people who've come to these information sessions in the first place before circulating that expression of interest form more widely. So if you're interested, do fill it out as soon as possible. The admin team will then be going off and doing the processing, so notification of places will be around about the 20th of November, and that's when we'll be sorting out the group sign up. Hopefully we'll be having an orientation session with those who volunteer to be mentors around early December. Early January, all of the kind of administrative elements of Python study group meeting invites, sorry, not invoices. This is free, don't worry, no charges. Invites will be getting circulated, and we will be meeting on Zoom for the Python study groups. And we have marked in the calendar the 23rd and 24th of January for the first Python study group meetings. So that's when they're going to be taking place. And we'll be looking to have the first governance meeting around the end of February, sometime in March. So that's the timeline. Please do now fill out the expression of interest form if you want to get involved.